This is Nikos Alexiou, the Hellenic American Project, Department of Sociology, Queen's College CUNY. We have an interview, very happy and pleased to have a Greek American artist, Magda Parasidis, who is a painter, and we have a chance to hear a few things about her work. Magda, thank you for accepting having this interview with HUB.
Thank you for having me.
And tell us where you are now. What do we see?
I'm in my home studio. It's a cozy little spot, but yeah, this is where I work, and I'm in Columbus, Ohio.
And I see, besides your books, you have also some of your work there.
I do have some of my work. My work is photography based. So
I hope you give us a chance to give us a small tour, seeing some of your work closer. I don't know if you have any slides to show now with us, but tell us about the art itself, some of your studies, some of the people who inspire you, the material you use.
Sure. So my practice is photography based. So all of the imagery that I create begins from photography. Another element in the work is always text. So whether text that's original, written by me, or literature or theorists that have inspired in some way the work, or in conversation with the work, and that will then be handwritten on the photographs. So so it's rooted in photography, and then there are a number of interventions. I've moved more and more into collage work, so that I'm actually sort of manipulating the photographs and reassembling them. And it's a hand-based process, so I'm not using Photoshop or other digital technologies. It's a labor-intensive work, let's say. So I'm working with the photographs with my hands.
So so you also a photographer. You take the pictures, or you use?
Yes, all of the work begins with my photographs. Yes, so I think that's how I came to art. As I was gifted an analog, a manual camera by my brother when I was about 15. And immediately the subject matter that I was interested in photographing were, my environment, my neighborhood, specifically the public housing in which I grew up. Myself was the second, subject, so portraits. And then as my universe sort of expanded outside of Astoria, I was photographing people with what I call alternative ambitions. So either, drag queens, punk, teenagers, people somehow functioning and living outside of what I considered the norm of my neighborhood. That's what I was photographing. And so that's how my practice begins.
By training, I am a sociologist, and I remember I wanted to understand the social role of photography, and one of the early books I read was Roland Barthes, the Camera Obscura.
Yes.
It's a lot of sociology also around photography, right? How you see photography? Let's start with that. I mean, nowadays with these great advances in technology, especially the iPhones, etc., with the tremendous cameras, everybody thinks that he or she are photographers. It's not just like that, right?
Photography for me has been the way in which I can slow down in order to understand myself in relation to my interests. So I think as a teenager, I was trying to understand where I live. I was trying to understand the architecture, and so I would photograph it. I would photograph the buildings, and now, 30 years later, I'm still photographing those buildings. So it's a way to slow down and to look, and then questions begin to emerge. So it seems like there are a number of steps for me, at least, sort of intellectually. There's something about the aesthetics of a place, that feel like they're communicating a lot more than I have a grasp on. And so then I photograph those spaces, and then I begin to do sort of the sociological, the critical research, and then, images start to take shape. So the photograph doesn't end at the making of the photograph. It then gets sort of manipulated and worked and reworked.
Very, very interesting. And also collage is also a very, very interesting, way of expression, because it involves a combination of things, right? Tell us about the art of collage. Yeah.
It's been, I'm not a person who enjoys, drawing, but I do like drawing sort of by putting different images together. And there's an element of thrift, of using everything in the work, so that, a photograph that I might make that may seem like an unsuccessful photograph will at some point be, used again. That I think has a lot to do with my culture, or at least with the values with which, I grew up. This idea of using everything.
Yeah. I remember also Susan Sontag talking
on photography.
On photography, a classic book, and also as a basis for how the way we see is very important, right? The politics or the sociology or the aesthetics of how we see things. Very, very, very interesting. So you start with something in your mind first, or you take a photography first, and then you create the images, and then you execute your plan. How the process, the production process of your art, the various stages, how it worked for you?
I think that, it starts with an idea of the kind of questions that I want to explore, and the kinds of emotions also that I want to investigate. So, for example, with the, a recent conceptual project called Ghosts in Sunlight, of which you can see this one image right behind me as one of them. I was certainly going to photograph the public housing buildings, and I saw that I kept photographing them at night. So, I would photograph them during the day, and that wasn't the mood, that wasn't where I was, that wasn't what was interesting. And so the project turned out to be, all photographs, all taken at night, taken with no artificial light, and simply with the surveillance lights coming off the buildings themselves. And so I had this body of photographs that were these stark images of public housing at night, illuminated only by these surveillance lights, bringing into focus how many cameras were on the buildings, how many prohibitory signs were on the buildings. And that was really the story. I mean, that was the story for me. It was like, what do the aesthetics of this place tell about how we consider the people living within and behind those walls? And how do the aesthetics of that place both reinforce keeping people on the margins, and at the same time, through the production of art, through the production of culture out of these spaces, how do we resist those narratives? So the whole project becomes a counter narrative to how we criminalize the poor. And I began to see that the housing that I grew up in the places where we place our poor, predominantly immigrant, Black and brown people are actually carceral spaces. So spaces of containment, spaces of surveillance, and spaces that quite frankly don't look incredibly different from a lot of the aesthetics of prison.
Yeah, the control. Yeah, the control, right? And
yes. So you know how present the state is, you know, as this panopticon, this you know, this eye on your life.
Yeah, the panopticon. Yeah, or the big brother watching all the time.
So these were the kinds of, you know, the images came, obviously my experience living in public housing comes first, and my sort of questioning all of these things, and then making these images that were all nighttime, and being, you know, surprised by these, you know, beautiful images sort of lit only from, you know, from the shining lights, and then, you know, and then deepening my research on, you know, sociologically on how we treat the poor, on how we automate poverty, you know, just deepening and deepening with you know, academic readings, and then sort of and then the project takes shape.
So let's elaborate a little bit the title of this project that you have. Very interesting title. Very is a strong you know, language there.
It's just a strong language. I have to tell you, there was a moment where, you know, I don't begin as an artist. I begin as a designer for many years, and so there was a moment where I, you know, had to make sort of a very conscious decision that I was going to sort of shift. I needed to shift from being a producer of you know, consumer products to being a producer of visual ideas. And so at that moment, I read an article by a cultural critic named Hilton Als, and that article was entitled "Ghosts in Sunlight," and it was a quote taken from Truman Capote, who, when he was filming In Cold Blood, after writing it, he's then on, you know, on location filming it, and he's like, you know, seeing this sort of come to light is like seeing your ghosts in sunlight. You know, it's like shedding this light on you know, all of these intuitions that had been brewing, you know, like, so all these intuitions of mine of understanding, like, that a lot of the obstacles that that I've sort of faced psychologically, let's say, you know, in my career, in my adulthood, they stem in large part from what was communicated to me by the aesthetics of place, right? You understand yourself by also through your environment.
It is a series of images. How many images you include in that project?
That project, I think, has between 45 and 50 images, and it's culminated in a solo show at Otterbein University here in Columbus. And I've also published a monograph of that work. So very interesting, and it's interesting that the university was you know, supportive of this. You saw the reaction of college students on that? Oh, I mean, it was just, you know, the opening was in September of 2020. And so this was right after, you know, the summer of, you know, the eruption of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it was just such a moment where we were all so starved for culture, you know, but also really wanting to talk about everything, especially in an academic environment. So it was such a vibrant experience.
But how prophetic was your title? Because not only you had the ghosts in housing, but also ghosts in the towns, whole those cities. I mean, how you experienced the lockdown and the pandemic as an artist?
I have to tell you, I'm by nature an introvert, so I enjoy spending time alone, and I didn't suffer the way others did. I didn't mind sort of closing in, closing down. I had a lot of work to do, and a lot of things to sort of work out in silence, and that worked out all right for me. And it also, created all these opportunities to hear people speak, like this via Zoom. So I, all of a sudden, these artists that I was interested in, or writers that I was interested in, became more available in some ways, by being able to hear them speak about their work.
How do you know what project to follow?
Yeah,
When
it's
let's say, oh, let's say, well, something's bothering me.
yeah. We spoke about this a little bit. It's that, it's the lightning bolt of inspiration where you're like, oh, is this really what I have to do now? It's almost decided for you.
Yeah.
And so I was, really ready to sort of let go of, I was like, okay, I've photographed the projects, and, I've talked about these things, and I was ready to move on to something else. And I don't think it's not ready to let go of me. So in my most recent work, what I'm doing and thinking about are the immigrant women living in public housing and the restrictions imposed on them in their effort to either beautify their living environments and to raise their families. So specifically, any kind of gardening or interventions on public spaces were prohibited and are prohibited by the codes of conduct of when you sign your Section 8 public housing agreement. And so my mother, along with other Greek American women, they saw soil and they would plant. They all have plants in their homes, and they would try to transplant those things outside, especially during spring and summer, and they would be systematically pulled up. And so there are these, sort of prohibited gardens, that would last maybe a month or two. But then when, the maintenance or landscaping would come to, survey the environment, all of these things would be ripped out. And so in my most recent work, I'm, again, I've photographed these spaces, but now I'm starting to use some of the traditional Greek and foreign, but folk techniques of embroidery. So I'm using embroidery on photographs to depict these prohibited gardens in public housing.
Very, very interesting project. So does the general environment plays a role for you? I mean, because sometimes you create here in America, sometimes you create in other places, Greece, for example. Does the environment play a role for you in terms of inspiration?
Certainly. I mean, my family and I tend to travel to Greece at least once a year, and one of the things, or one of the places that I was most interested in seeing in Athens on this last trip were some of the autonomous and anti-authoritarian zones in Athens. So I had been, reading and researching these places, specifically Exarchia, other occupied theaters, Theater Ebros, which is in downtown Gazi. I was also interested in seeing the equivalent, let's say, to public or low-income housing in Athens. So those were spaces that I was drawn to, and I've made images, many images of those spaces. So I think it begins with an interest in a certain story or in a certain ethos, and then trying to see if I could make images to work with,
Yeah, it was always a debate if art should play a role as a political force or a social public advocate or not, to be concerned only with the aesthetics. So it's always this debate. There are articles or books,
like, is there really a debate? I mean, artists are commenting on the moment in which they live, right? It's like you're an artist and you're translating visually sort of how you're living and experiencing the contemporary world.
Oh.
And maybe not all artists are doing that, but it's certainly the art that I'm interested in is doing that.
Yeah. So yeah, it is the question of relevance. If art should have some relevance with the existing conditions, right? So the conditions that exist at the moment. Yeah, because I was reading a book recently, a defense of the arts by Pearl, who is also a critic. And this is the debate that, you know, should art have this kind of relevance or not? And for me, of course, but and your work speaks for itself. You know, the relevance it should have. And I think in order to be a contemporary artist, cannot live outside of society, right? Is this how you approach your art? That your art should be situated within the narrative, within the dialogue that exists in society already, right?
Certainly.
How you want people to receive your art, for example, besides the pleasure by itself, right?
I think that as I mature as an artist, I'm beginning to see that none of us exist outside of sort of these social and historical narratives, right? Our very identity, the way that we present to the world, sort of we carry on our shoulders all of the things that have informed our becoming an individual. So I think that you can't separate, you can't separate what you're going to produce sort of from this very contemporary moment that also carries legacies behind. So you embody those things as a person, and obviously the things that you're going to produce are going to embody those things. So I think that as time goes on, I'm softening a bit, although my work is clearly, my work is political, my work is rooted in critique. My work wants to investigate, dominant narratives and other ways of being and other ways of imagining. I want to do all those things, but I can feel that I can soften. I can soften because the work is going to carry that in the way it looks, in the way it presents. It's going to carry that if one is interested in looking, So I think I'm less interested in how my work will be received. I think it either will be or it won't.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, no, I think you're right on that. And you said relevance. Art is something that gives us pleasure, of course, but at the same time, we need to think about certain things, right? And also help people realize situations. Is the state an art-friendly society? I mean, throughout your studies and creative life, you found people supportive of the arts?
Perhaps my experience is unique, but my adopted state of Ohio and my adopted city of Columbus have supported me in so many ways. There's an Ohio Arts Council and a Greater Columbus Arts Council, and they've helped me, with grants, and they've helped me with recognition. And I've, find myself showing in a private, private universities, but still within like sort of a public domain. And so in my personal experience, I've been incredibly supported. I think that there are some artists that do better in commercial sort of art galleries, and that's not sort of the kind of work that I'm doing. I think I'm doing more sort of academic art that lends itself to public spaces, to public conversations.
How about the Greek American community? A community that, they are very pleased to identify themselves as a community with tremendous socioeconomic mobility. You had any help, any support from the Greek American community?
I mean, I haven't thus far, other than meeting you and seeing the Hellenic American Project and learning about other Greek American artists working today. That has been enormously helpful to me, but not in a way of, I'm not part of a Greek American artist community or, supported in any sort of way. What I do want to say is that, I think the Greek immigrant community really prides itself for their upward mobility, for their sort of economic successes. And one of the things that my work does is it recovers another history. It recovers a story of other Greek immigrants, not the ones who have, gone to Ivy Leagues and, created businesses and success and wealth, but, these other predominantly, immigrant women living and working and resisting, within the context of a poor urban neighborhood situated within a Greek enclave. So, I don't know. I would have to, we would have to have a forum and see how Greek Americans would, sort of respond to telling that story.
And it should be included, because you are right. From various sociological studies and my own research, I realized that the dominant narrative within the community, it is struggle and success, but a lot of things are omitted, and therefore the immigrant experience of the Greek American community is incomplete. This is what I realize every time I focus on my research. So I agree with you that you cannot choose what to present and leave other things out. All of it is part of of our experience. Therefore, they should be included into our experience. So tell us now about the work. How long it takes you, let's say, the moment of you having an idea to materialize it, to I understand that a work of art never ends, never stops. But when you decide, after how long you decide, well, this is it.
It's an incredibly long process, and when it begins again, I almost take like a deep breath, because you're going on faith. Like, I think it took me the better part of 4 years to complete the Ghosts in Sunlight project, from the first images to presenting it whole as a body of work. And now as I move into sort of new work, some of which you can see behind me, I know that it'll be a multi-year process. I have the way that I work. I have an image of a pretty large narrative I want to tell. And so it's not about making individual works as much as sort of an entire encompassing project. It's how I work conceptually. I need to have sort of this larger idea and then sort of begin to give it flesh with with images, and that takes an incredibly long time. And another part of my process is just an incredible amount of reading. I think that the visual images become stronger as they're more and more informed by and sort of married to other ideas and other people's ideas and other people's work. And so, yeah, all of that together, takes a
Well,
very long.
you see that you see your work or what you create um, as a collective, right? It's a collectivity. You know, it's a fusion of many ideas, people, media, right? So,
You know, I had a friend of mine say, you know, how did it feel to, you're sort of working in obscurity, you know, you're in Columbus, you know, you don't have like sort of a community of artists that you're, you know, engaging with, like you're sort of working out there on the margins, and I don't feel like that at all. You know, I'm in constant conversation with literature, theorists, artists, poets, you know, whether, you know, I'm no longer in New York and I don't have that immediate sort of, you know, the feeling, the energy of actually being in the spaces with you know, with my contemporaries. But my practice, yeah, it really does feel like a collective. Yeah. I'm working with many people's ideas and from many different areas, not just visual arts. Mm-hmm.
yeah, because I think I never believed in the isolation and the separation of the arts. Arts can combine many things, and that's why I like what you do with the collage, the different media. You have photography, painting, other ways. So this is very interesting because the arts cannot be, you know, separated and not communicating. So the communication among the various media. Um, so tell us more about the ghost. So the images we saw behind the housing, uh, it was from New York, but you finished the work in Ohio.
Exactly. So
Very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, so you know, I find myself in Queens, you know, 3 or 4 times a year because that's where my mother and friends live. So I'm often there, and every time I'm there, I'm certainly part of being there is working. So I'm making images there and then bringing them back to the studio and working them out over time. Yeah, this image that you see sort of right behind me, do you see these lines coming across? And then we can put together, you know, some images to share, but you know, that's thread. So it's interesting to see, you know, sort of older Greek American women respond to this work, you know, when they see it, because so many of them have the experience of being seamstresses and working in, you know, in many times Greek American owned factories in Astoria. And so this is the story of countless Greek American women sort of actually being exploited by other Greek Americans, but working with their hands and working in the factories until they closed. So I think my mother worked as a seamstress in one of these factories, I would say up until 2002, when the last ones shuttered. So yeah, so it's a project of sort of, you know, collecting images and also collecting stories.
Very interesting. Also, if you have any something to share regarding what is to be a female artist and some of the challenges that that you know, a young female artist faces.
I have to say that
Does it matter?
a lot of the most difficult for me work to produce has been the work that directly investigates you know, what it is to mother in poverty, you know, or to be a woman within, you know, the structures of public assistance, you know, the humiliations that sort of accompany being a woman and being poor and simply being a woman and being alive, quite frankly. So, you know, I think that the subject matter is difficult for me because of how sort of radically personal it feels. And that is the work that's least engaged with, to be honest, you know, because it's so sort of so personal, so feminist, so sort of naming the humiliations. That's the work that's sort of that's least least talked about, or least, you know, people don't want to engage. And it, you know, it's difficult to produce, it's difficult to look at, and it's difficult to engage with. So for me, it's really that. It's not about, you know, have I not had, you know, opportunities in art spaces because I'm a woman. That's not really, you know, that's not the critical matter in my experience. It's, you know, it's how to make difficult subject matter palatable, you know, to an art public.
Since you occupy two cultures, you know, the Greek culture in Greece and also the American culture here, do you see progress as far as concerned the role or the position of women within each of those respective societies?
I mean, I think that the things that were acceptable to women like me 10 or 15 years ago are no longer acceptable today, generally. And so that is progress. You know, the world is changing. The world is changing.
At the same time, during the pandemic, it is an explosion in domestic violence.
Yeah.
It is an explosion in abuse against children and women in particular. In many countries, they have invented code names for to make a phone call and give a secret message, so some authorities can intervene. So
yeah, no, I certainly think that, you know, misogyny, like racism, is alive and well. I think that there are increasing avenues to talk about things without shame, and to have and to have support over that. You know, I think that some of the subject matter that I've dealt with, there weren't opportunities to speak 20 years ago. I didn't feel like there were opportunities to speak 20 years ago. And so, you know, another thing that I'm doing with my most recent work is sort of recovering women's practices, including embroidery, and announcing that they're in some ways radical practices, you know, of how to be, and of how we recover knowledge that comes from the underground, you know, not knowledge from the top down, but knowledge from sort of the bottom up. And, you know, what can that teach us about other ways of being, about reconsidering, you know, those things, about reconsidering craft and handiwork and women's work. So yeah, these are all some of the things that I'm working on.
Excellent. You have a chance to see some of your work, and any specific images you would like to share with us today, and we can talk about them. Do you have them handy?
Sure. Shall I bring you to them?
Yes, of course. And I hope soon we're gonna have another with her. I hope I work on exhibition at some point.
So one of the things that I really have wanted to explore are spaces in Athens and ways of being that have people that are trying to
faces there, yeah,
set up anti-authoritarian spaces in Athens. So here you see some, you see Exarchia, you see some workers' residences, street images. So these are all sort of.
Exarchia has a lot of graffiti there in Exarchia.
Exarchia is a work of art in and of itself. There is almost no surface that's not occupied, occupied by street art. It's an incredible place to experience. To experience myself on the street of Exarchia. I'm from New York City. I'm interested in, have actively been, in spaces that are occupied by street art, but I've never experienced anything like Exarchia. The amount of political posters, graffiti, but graffiti, not just, tags, but entire vistas of what these young artists are imagining could happen in these derelict and abandoned spaces.
In the episode therapy, in the past, before the pandemic, I have created a study abroad course and visited Athens, and we live on Hippocrates, which is the border with Exarchia and Kolonaki. And I remember the American students seeing the presence of police and sometimes the army in the periphery around Exarchia. So it is all those things you say, but at the same time, it's some kind of fear, some kind of police or army, military presence.
The state presence, in the neighborhood is certainly there to intimidate. So in the squares and in the plazas, there'll be, groups of young men talking, and at the other end of the platea, there'll be, the police officers, with large sort of machine guns, on view. And so it's an intimidation factor that the neighborhood on any given day feels perfectly peaceful. In fact, there are incredible businesses. Like there's a business that I came across named Zvura. Zvura is a neighborhood market where producers bring their things to market and get paid as they sell. So it's, sort of this cooperative mutual aid. There were countless spaces that had been, occupied by refugees, as we know. And just the amount of artistic production in the neighborhood and how much is available for free to whoever wants to participate. The radio stations that are live from these underground rooms in Exarchia, the TV crews that are telling their own stories of what's actually happening. So it's an incredible place. I feel like there would be so much to learn from how people are taking sort of control of their own means of survival and of artistic communication.
So when you were taking pictures of around Exarchia, you had any incidents with the?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yes. I mean, there's the feeling of, everyone's sort of at high alert. Who is this person? Is this person a journalist? Is taking photographs of us?
Yeah,
what's that? Yes. Or is it an agent of the state? Yes. And so, especially taking images of the squats, it felt like I was imposing. It certainly felt like I was imposing. So, I responded by going to the market and buying, diapers and rice and canned goods and whatever, I could afford, and sort of taking it to their door and knocking on it and leaving it out front. That's how I responded, because, I understand, the feelings of intimidation. So, yeah, that was challenging.
Yeah, very, very challenging. You had an opportunity to exhibit in Greece at all, in Athens, or yeah?
I haven't, but I think that the newer work that's coming that will be produced in the next few years, I think that that will find a home in Greece. I mean, I would like that very much. I'm not sure. I think that the Ghost in Sunlight project was something, very specific. And, it's found a home here, and that has all felt right. But I think I would love to exhibit in Greece at some point.
Yeah, it is. You mentioned some of the areas like Gaza, etc., which is very artistic neighborhoods and Exarchia, and they have galleries and they have. And one thing that I have a huge problem with here in Astoria, is that although Astoria is considered the symbol of Greek immigration in the 20th century, and it has a very strong Greek presence, there's not one gallery people can exhibit their works. There's not such a thing. I mean, when you are here, you feel that there is no.
I do. I also feel like Greek Americans do such a disservice to Greek culture by propagating a kitsch version of our aesthetics. So, I mean, it's not just that there isn't, an art gallery. It's also that what does exist.
Or a bookstore. There's no bookstore.
Or a bookstore, right? So what does exist is such a sort of surface kitschy representation of our food, of our culture, of our aesthetics, right? So we have to work on getting some, enormous grant.
Yeah, well,
so we create these spaces.
Here at Queen's College, at the premises of the Hellenic American Project, I have a small area that it can function as a small gallery. So we can have some exhibits when we open up. I hope we have this opportunity. But yes, I think in order for an ethnic community to continue its survival, it cannot be separately from the arts. It's okay to have the schools, the church, other ethnic associations, but without having a strong basis on about the arts, it cannot survive. Right? Do you feel that way?
I do. I grew up sort of going to Greek school and being immersed in my culture, but much of my understanding of my Greekness comes from other avenues. It comes from literature. It comes from film. So yeah, if there was a way to sort of, I had to discover these things on my own, and I'm so fortunate that I did. But if there were some markers, if there was some help along the way, to say, hey, these are our contemporary writers, and that, and that Greekness doesn't exist somewhere in this, ancient past, but exists right now. I think that's such a potent message.
So you have in mind a project for the future, but looking back, are some things that you see them now and you say, I should have done it differently as far as concerns your creative side?
No, I mean, I mentioned to you earlier, I think, I probably, lost a decade of art production because I was sort of, busy trying to survive with, paying work. So, I mean, I think that if anything, it would be that. It was that, I in my experience, I didn't find the markers along the way or the examples, along the way to say, a life in the arts is viable for a new immigrant. That was not a message that I received, So as far as, what I've made and the sorts of inquiries that I'm making, those feel good and solid, and it's just that I wish it had happened.
Yeah, well,
in some ways.
I don't see that as a problem at all, because I think in general the arts, they have their own timing. functions differently when it comes to creative, production than, having deadlines for a paper, an academic paper, or etc. So I think the concept of time is totally different. So I don't see that as a problem. And it was, especially for poetry, because I'm more familiar, perhaps, it was a tradition in the early years that it took longer for poets to publish. It was a traditional. Let's say Robert Frost. He started publishing when he was 40. So I cannot see it as a waste or some kind of problem if you have the 10 years that you mentioned. I think that individual artists and as a collective, each one needs to find his or her own,
unfolding. Yes.
Yeah. So I see it that way, and I think I realize what you say, that it's good to have more of the arts. Probably this is what we're trying to say, that people should be exposed to the arts as early as possible, right? And have the opportunities, as you said. But this is for everything, I think, right? Not only for the art. It is for access, early access to literature, to
Yes.
things, all this. You think that you would like to see your children to be artists, or is something you want to advise them not to attempt?
Oh, I mean, I have the great luxury of being able to tell them that they can do anything that interests them. I mean, and I understand that perhaps my mother didn't have that luxury to say, here's the world, and it's yours to explore. That wasn't a message that I think that she ever received, and it wasn't one that she could pass along to me. But I certainly feel like they could, do anything and make it work, and that there are resources, and yeah.
Very, very interesting.
I don't feel the same limits, is what I'm saying. Yeah. And I think that happens, right, with second and then third and fourth generation immigrants. Like, those limits start to erode, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So is any immediate plan for an exhibition now with any venue here in New York or there in Ohio? You have some plans to have an exhibition soon?
Well, I'm actively showing in many group exhibitions. So there's a group exhibition in Chicago called Lens 2022 through this gallery called Perspective. There are group shows in Ohio in public spaces at the Medici Museum, just outside Columbus. So I'm actively in many group showings. But during this time, it's like you've caught me, I've completed this huge body of work that's still in circulation. And, that makes me so happy that it's out in the world and it's being seen. But it's also like I'm getting ready for this couple of years that, where I'm actively in the process of creating. And so I haven't shown any of that work yet.
And where people can see your activities, your future plans, your work now, is any place that people can know about your work?
So, one of the places where artists show what they're working on most immediately is through Instagram. So people can see my work at Magda Parasidis on Instagram. And it's really it's such a gift to be able to share, right in that moment, what you're doing and where you're showing and where people could see it out in the world. And, people can actually visit you in your studio and see your work in progress. So that is, that's the way.
Yeah. When it comes a time to sell some of your work, how do you feel? Is something that you're losing something of your own?
It's been a process of learning. Like I've sold about half of the work from Ghosts in Sunlight. And each time, you know, it's such, you know, I mean, I know I can't hold on to all of it. It feels incredibly fortunate that someone would want to live with my work. And so that's what I focused on. I've never said no. You know, my children love 2 or 3 pieces. They said, okay, these are just not for sale because I want them when I'm older. But for everything else, I feel so fortunate that someone would want to live with it, and that, you know, I've somehow, you know, my ideas and these images become part of their lives. So I let go.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing. I understand that. Yeah, that's why I wanted to,
Yeah.
you know, to talk about this. Is there anything else you'd like to add regarding your work? Something that
It feels like such an honor to have this time to just to talk about ideas and to talk about yeah, my art production, and that this will somehow, you know, be archived in such a way that some other, you know, young Greek American or old Greek American artists, you know, will see this and feel in some way, you know, encouraged.
Thank you very much. And as I said, I'll be more than glad if we can schedule to have an exhibition here at HUB with your work and the Greek American community of New York that, you know, you grew up with.
That would just be a dream.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Alexiou.
Bye-bye.